Hello and welcome to this next webinar, Tharawat webinar with the Center for Strategic Philanthropy at the University of Cambridge. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us. My name is Farida El-Agami. I'm the General Manager of the Tharawat Family Business Forum, and it's my pleasure to guide us here today through this webinar of around 1 hour. And we have a wonderful panel of speakers today. Together with me, moderating this session will be Claire Woodcraft, who's the Executive Director at the Center for Strategic Philanthropy at the University of Cambridge. And we have our two keynote speakers, Naila Farouky, who's the CEO and Executive Director of the Arab Foundations Forum in Jordan, and Silvia Bastante de Unverhau, who is the Chief Philanthropy Officer at CoImpact in Switzerland. Today's session will be very interactive, so we encourage all of you to ask us questions. It's really looking to be a session that should be very hands-on and very practical, so please feel free to interact with us and use your Q&A fields, participate in the polls. Should you have any issues with your connection, feel free to contact our team, of course. You can find at the bottom right of your screen, you can find some contact details of our team. The way we are going to run this session is we will give short introductory remarks to kind of frame the topic of today a little bit. Then we will have a conversation with Naila and Silvia, who really have very extremely interesting and particular perspectives on collaborative giving. And it will be a great opportunity for us all to really ask the questions that we want to ask around how to coordinate, how to collaborate in this very, very important field. So without any further ado, and before introducing Claire, I would like to just say a couple of words about why this is taking place and why we are having these webinars, the series of webinars with the CSP, with the Center for Strategic Philanthropy. So the Tharawat Family Business Forum, of course, is a non-for-profit organization. We are a non-for-profit network of family business owners, and the whole purpose of our collaboration with the CSP is really to bring together philanthropists and family business owners who are looking to become more strategic in their approach to charity, philanthropy, even CSR and impact investing. And so this is really part of an entire effort of our organization in collaboration with our partners to make sure that we offer you the best possible input and knowledge for the next, let's say, phase of philanthropic activities in our region. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Claire Woodcraft, who is going to introduce CSP and as well as a couple of framing comments. Thank you, Claire.
Great, thanks Farida. Good morning, everybody. Great to see you all. Good afternoon for those of you in the region. Delighted to be at our second part of this series of webinars with Tharawat, really looking at how we can help collectively to improve the impact of philanthropy. And specifically today, of course, looking at the issue of collaboration. So in my couple of decades of experience of working in philanthropy, I think if I had $1 for every time somebody said, we need to collaborate, I'd be a very rich woman. It is indeed something that we have talked about a huge amount as practitioners in the region, looking at how we can improve the impact and how we can drive best practice. For us at the Center for Strategic Philanthropy, collaboration is very much in our DNA. It's really the essence of why we exist. And why that is because we believe that collaboration can radically improve impact, can offset duplication, can help us avoid wasting resources. And we think it can help share best practice across the region. We know that there are multiple active philanthropists in the Middle East, the Arab world and beyond. And yet too often we see that these entities are not able to work together. And often it's not from lack of intention or lack of willingness. It can be perhaps because from a regulatory perspective, it's difficult to work across borders. Sometimes it's simply somewhat in the DNA of philanthropic organizations to go it alone, and they're not aware of the opportunities of working more broadly. And sometimes it's simply not practical to be able to run programs of philanthropic interventions that move beyond borders. So that's really what we want to explore today. And we believe at the CSP that this is really part of our mission to help encourage best practice, bring practitioners together through thought leadership panels like this, and also support this work through our research agenda and through our executive education program, which are targeting exactly the audience that Farida has talked about. So especially next gen, young and up and coming members of family offices who are interested in getting involved in philanthropy, but perhaps want to do things differently. We've also just completed our first piece of research on the impact of COVID-19 on philanthropists in our core markets, the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And needless to say, collaboration came up time and time again, not only as a means of helping philanthropists work better with governments and align with national policy, also as a means of helping philanthropists share knowledge intra-regionally, and also as a way of encouraging peer funding and crowdfunding across multiple philanthropic ecosystems. So clearly, even with the crisis, we have seen that collaboration can be a critical tool of driving resilience and sustainability for social purpose organizations. So I'm delighted today to be able to introduce our first speaker, from CoImpact is an organization that I regularly cite, and indeed we have cited them in our report, as one of the few entities that has actually been able to deliver on this vision for collaboration. And we know that collaboration can mean multiple things, from simply sharing knowledge and information, networking, etc. But what we really like about the CoImpact model is that it goes right down to the funding issue. That CoImpact has been able to pool philanthropic capital and create interventions that allow philanthropists to work directly together. So we're really excited to have with us today Silvia from CoImpact. She's the Chief Philanthropy Officer, and she has been helping really build the business model of CoImpact from the very beginning. Prior to that, Silvia was working at UBS as the Global Head of Philanthropy Advisory. And for those of you that don't know, UBS, in my humble opinion, is one of the banks that did a great job, thanks to Silvia and her teams, of really pioneering this idea of getting banks involved in thought leadership and promoting a better way of doing philanthropy. So Silvia joins us today from Switzerland, where she currently lives, but although she's originally from Peru. Sylvia and I, our paths cross regularly at events which sadly no longer happen. But it's really great to have you with us here today, Sylvia. I'm going to hand over to you and just let you start, if you would, by just giving us a flavor of the model of CoImpact, how you have gone about overcoming this deeply entrenched challenge for many markets of actually getting philanthropists to collaborate and come together, what that looks like in practical terms, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities therein. Thanks, Sylvia. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Claire, for the very kind introductions, and thanks also, Farida, for inviting me today. Yes, as you were saying, Claire, collaboration in theory is such a good thing. In practice, it doesn't happen enough. There's more talk than practice. So maybe I can share a little bit about CoImpact and our model. The primary reason that CoImpact was started was because we observed such huge dispersion of efforts in the field of philanthropy. You have many philanthropists and foundations that are wanting to do something good in their communities, and I wanted to have impact, sometimes also cross-border, but everybody's doing their own thing. And we thought that there could potentially be a different way of bringing philanthropists together, so that they can share one set of due diligence, so that they could make the whole process much more efficient, and at the same time deliver the forms of capital that the social change leaders at the forefront and the organizations at the forefront of making change in their own countries could take. You know that most philanthropy is actually quite restrictive. It's usually relatively small amounts and relatively short term. So small projects. And this happens all around the world and also in the Middle East. And the idea was, you know, if we could bring a group of philanthropists together to collaborate, could we give bigger, more long-term supports, more unrestricted, and also more focused on what we call systems change or supporting systems change. So CoImpact is a global collaborative of philanthropists. When it was launched, we had 5 core partners. We now have over 40 funders and philanthropists from more than 16 countries around the world. I am happy to say that there is at least one Middle Eastern institution that has chosen to join this collaborative. They pool their funding at different levels. The starting point is $500,000 per year with a minimum commitment of 3 years. And we have all the way to core partners that give us $50 million over 10 years, and in some cases even more. So we pull all this funding, and we are able to support initiatives in education, health, and economic opportunity in low and middle income countries around the world. And we do so with systems change grants, which are supposed to help these organizations or coalitions of actors to really make a very significant change in terms of scale, so reaching millions of people, and to do so in a way that's sustainable. So either driving for governments, for national or regional or local governments to adopt a particular approach, or for some sort of viable commercial solution.
Great, thanks for that, Silvia. So we're going to come back to you, of course, once we've heard from Naila. In particular, I think it would be great for our audience today here to hear more about how you choose which interventions you want to support, and also how they themselves as family offices could get involved, and perhaps give us some examples of the family offices that are part of your 40-strong funders. First, I'm going to hand back over to Farida so we can hear from Naila. Over to you, Farida.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction, Silvia. Just a little comment. Someone was, one of our members on the call was just WhatsApping me and saying, you know, this sounds almost like we're going into kind of a fund structure situation in philanthropy. So I think that might be something that we can pick back up later on, because I think it's also something that, you know, corresponds to some of the technical understanding of some of the people that are involved on this call as well. So of course, now it's my great pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker, Naila Farouky. Naila is honestly a very inspiring and wonderful leader in this space. She is the CEO of the Arab Foundations Forum, truly under her leadership, a very important organization, which is quite unique also in our region, to be very honest, where obviously philanthropy is quite decentralized and sometimes slightly scattered. And so Naila has made sure that the Arab Foundation Forum has become really a platform that gathers many of the big organizations and you know, creates also the best practice that we require in our region. So Naila has over 20 years of experience in philanthropic management. And so it's great and wonderful to have someone with regional experience on this call as well, or on this webinar, to give us her perspective. So over to you, Naila. Welcome to this webinar.
Thank you, Farida. So I'll just dive right in and give a little bit of an overview of the Arab Foundations Forum for those of you who don't know us. We're a membership-based network of Arab foundations and Arab philanthropy organizations that are working in the region, as well as other organizations that have any kind of philanthropic activity in the region. The AFF was started in 2006. And it began as a sub-project to a larger foundation, the Welfare Association, or Mu'assasat al-Ta'awun. In 2011, we registered as an independent entity. We registered in Belgium with a branch office in Jordan. So that's why a lot of people often think that we're based out of Jordan, but we're actually not specific to Jordan. We're a regional entity. And we function across 5 kind of strategic objectives when it comes to how we manage our network. So the first one obviously is networking, because that's kind of the raison d'etre of the forum. And then we work around knowledge and resource, collecting knowledge and resources and making them available to our network. And that network extends beyond just our members, right? So we're trying to kind of have our footprint be across the entire sector, because as Farida may have kind of touched on a little bit, the AFF is the only organization of its kind in the region. So there are no other, there is no other forum for grant-making foundations in the region. So there tends to be a little bit of pressure on us to kind of make sure that we, that we cover many, many bases. And then we also work on capacity development. And we've tried over the years to really make that be a very kind of customized and curated type of content for our particular kind of members. There's a wealth of capacity development that you can access online and through other networks, but it doesn't necessarily always, it's not always necessarily curated content-wise, specifically to speak to grant makers and foundations that are doing the kind of work that our members are doing. And that kind of work is also for our region a little bit unique, in that the sector of foundations in our region does not necessarily equate a grant maker strictly, right? So even though AFF, when it started as a network for grant making foundations, we over the years started to realize that we don't actually have that many that are strictly grant making entities. So many of them tend to be these kind of hybrid organizations that are both grant making and grant seeking. In some cases, they're also operational. So, you know, the definition of an NGO in our region is a little bit different than it might be in other places. And therefore, the definition of a foundation in our region is also a little bit different. So we really try to work on curating capacity development that speaks specifically to our region and to the actors in our region. And then our other two strategic objectives cover communications and outreach. We really see that as one kind of objective, and communicating and outreach on behalf of our network. So, you know, what we tell our members is, when you are a member of the AFF network, then your network as a whole is able to have a visibility on a global stage, so that we can kind of, you know, spread the message of what is Arab philanthropy about when we're with our peers, with our global peers. And then our last objective is around advocacy and policy. And, you know, we're very careful about what that entails, because obviously we are working in a region where there's a little bit of contention around the sector. And it's not always, you know, it's not always welcomed with open arms. So we have to be very careful about what that advocacy means. And so it's not activism. We're very clear about that. It's really more about raising awareness and kind of explaining and trying to work within the policies that govern our sector. So when it comes to collaboration, and kind of collaborative philanthropy, you know, I have a lot of thoughts about that and a lot of frustrations around how that can be implemented in our region. Of course, we have some anecdotal experience with it, but in terms of institutionally built-in collaborative systems that allow for our philanthropic actors to really, you know, we are hindered. And we're hindered mostly because of things that I think Silvia already mentioned, Claire already mentioned. It's really more around regulatory environments or the lack thereof. And, you know, I mean, I usually just break them down into three major obstacles. And not one of them is a lack of willingness for collaboration. So I think that's always kind of, you know, a myth around, oh, well, you know, Arab philanthropy doesn't want to collaborate. And that's very, I mean, if that's ever a reason, it's not because of a lack of willingness. So it really has more to do with, I believe, data and the lack of data in our region and in our sector specifically. The government restrictions, which are, you know, literally they just keep getting more and more and more and more restrictive. And then banking restrictions. And that's not necessarily really a regional thing, that's a global thing. If you are an Arab philanthropist or an Arab business person trying to do any business globally, then you have, you know, you've come across what those banking restrictions look like and how much of a challenge they can be. So even though within our network we have, you know, we have an expressed kind of intention of encouraging collaboration and cooperation, we've really had to try to be, in some cases, creative about how we navigate what that can look like, because it doesn't necessarily, you know, just because you have an MOU doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to accomplish anything. Right. You have a lot of cross-border giving restrictions. You have a lot of restrictions just in terms of creating partnerships from one, you know, between one country to the other. And I think what's really important for us to remember is, when we look at the region, you know, you're looking at 22 countries, you're looking at approximately 390 million people. And you're looking at a completely undiscovered and uncalculated wealth, and I mean that both, you know, figuratively and literally, and that poses a huge, you know, frustration, but then also an opportunity, right? So I think when we're looking at our network, we look at what are the things that are stopping our capacity to collaborate. And again, we go back to those 3 points, you know, the data, the government restrictions, the banking restrictions, but then we also look at culturally speaking, what does that mean for our region? So we know that we have a culture of anonymity around philanthropy because we have a very kind of religiously based attachment, right, to what our charity looks like. So the higher the anonymity of your charity, the higher the value that is placed on it. So just to kind of close out, I have one quote that I always use that one of our donors said to me once. And he said, you know, as a network, what you guys need to figure out is how do you convince the Arab, you know, philanthropic sector to go from an Allah deductible model to a tax deductible model. So, I mean, I know that's a very kind of oversimplification, but it is something to kind of think about.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Naila, also for really already deep diving into the regional specificities of the situation that we're facing at the moment. And I think it will be very interesting perhaps then to deep dive into that a bit further and also bring in, of course, Silvia's perspective. So I can see that we have a few really, really active philanthropists on our webinar today. So what I'd like to do is take this opportunity to ask a first question through the polls and really see a little bit how you know, your experience is with collaborative philanthropy. So we would be delighted if you could answer the following question. Has your family, your organization, or perhaps you as an individual philanthropist, have you collaborated with others on philanthropic projects before? So there is the option between yes, no, or that you are actually currently working on a collaborative project as well. So I'll give you a few more seconds to answer. Again, this is very interesting, actually. I can already see I have the only privilege of actually seeing as the votes come in. So, you know, I'm here kind of
So we'll give you a couple of seconds, Farida, to process the vote coming in. I just wanted to do a call out to a newfound friend of mine via Twitter, a gentleman called Paul Valerie, who's just written a book on philanthropy called Philanthropy from Aristotle to Zuckerberg. And why I mention it, because it relates directly to Naila's point about how fundamentally, intrinsically, philanthropy is integrated into Islam. I mean, it really, when I say it's part of the DNA, perhaps more so than any other specific theocratic structure. And it's a fascinating book that talks about the history. But I think that's important when we think about, you know, why people give and why, as Naila said, there is huge appetite to collaborate. This is not about the lack of appetite. It's about some of the other structural barriers, which we'll come back to once we've had the poll results.
Absolutely. And it's really fascinating because if we now look at the poll results, we can see that actually on this call, we have 50% of people who are active in philanthropy also have been collaborating. And I think that is really, really interesting to see because it does show us that, first of all, the appetite is there. People are basically within the projects that they are active in already working on these models. And I think the most important thing is that we now see, and I would encourage anyone who has answered yes or even no, actually to also perhaps in the chat share with us, you know, what the story is and what your experiences are, and perhaps also what you can share with others, what you've learned on this journey. And, you know, we also have to be very clear. There's one thing that I feel that sometimes we do overestimate a little, or we kind of misunderstand a little bit. Philanthropic projects can start from a very small scale all the way, you know, up to huge levels. So I think we have to be very careful that we don't judge in a way the scale of projects that we are talking about. And I think collaboration actually, perhaps even on a smaller scale, is perhaps even more important. So maybe Claire, I can hand over to you for the first couple of questions, but maybe we can also deep dive into that question a little bit later on.
Absolutely, and I fear we may not have enough time given to the richness of subjects we can discuss. But I want to pick up again on what you just said, actually. But one of the reasons our center was set up was because of the recognition that these growth markets, so Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia, and particularly the Middle East, are going to see an increase in philanthropic capital coming to market more significantly than other regions in the world, potentially, although of course COVID has created a whole new parameter around economic growth. That's what we wanted to be looking at. So if you have a new influx of philanthropic capital, how do you make sure that it's deployed as effectively as possible? And clearly one would suspect that collaboration is a good way to go about that. Our COVID-19 report, we actually cited specifically as a recommendation, the value of funding infrastructures like the Arab Foundations Forum, because in these emerging markets, where there are some institutional voids, it's much harder to exchange data that might be elsewhere. And infrastructure networks like the AFF can help address that void and thus encourage collaboration. Clearly, if I'm a philanthropist in Egypt and I want to collaborate with somebody in Tunisia, but I don't even know what's going on in Tunisia, that makes it really difficult. So I want to though just come back to Silvia, first of all, from her global perspective. So we know there's these institutional challenges in emerging markets. We know it's difficult to get funding cross borders. We know that governments are not facilitating at the moment. So Silvia, talk to us a little bit then about how, when you got your funders on board and when you've chosen your interventions, how do you manage some of these cross-border issues, and how do you actually practically pool that capital for our friends online who are interested in structuring funds?
Yeah. So I would say that whoever was that said that it's a model of a fund, it was spot on. That's exactly what it is. It's a little bit, in some ways, it's like a private equity fund where different investors put a certain amount of money and a commitment for a long period of time. Usually our core partners commit for 10 years. And then they see the philanthropic returns that come from some of the projects. Where it is different from private equity is in the sense that we're not nearly as controlling of the organizations that we choose to support. We actually choose to be a supportive funder as opposed to a controlling funder. But I wanted to, before I give you a couple of examples of how we do our sourcing and how we find the initiatives to support and how the collaboration works, I wanted to be slightly provocative and say that, you know, I understand what you're saying, that in the Middle East, it's not so simple to do this because of cross-border issues, because of legal issues or ways of channeling money as well, banking issues. But I would say in many parts of the world where all of that is possible, collaboration is still not very common. And a fund like CoImpact that brings together a number of philanthropists, it's very, very rare. There are a couple of examples of similar funds in the United States in particular, which happens to be quite a developed philanthropic market. But in most other parts of the world, this doesn't happen enough. And for all that I say that, you know, in 3 years, we've grown from 5 philanthropists and foundations to over 40. And obviously that makes us extremely, happy that we've been able to do this, because we've been able to deliver significant capital to some great initiatives out there. On the other hand, I say, for the number of philanthropists that there are in this world, for the number of foundations, for the amount of funding that is available, for the wealth that we have in the world, the level of collaboration is actually quite low. And my personal interpretation, given that I've worked with many foundations and philanthropists, is that, you know, most philanthropists and foundations first wants to start by doing things themselves, right? And that's the beginning, like literally giving whatever, $10,000, $5,000 to a particular project, seeing it very directly, right? And it's only after they gain a certain amount of experience and multiple years working as philanthropists that they realize, maybe, just maybe, working with others could help me to have greater impact in the world, right? So it takes a certain amount of experience and reflection for a foundation or a philanthropist to think, actually, it's not as simple as I thought to create the impact that I want. Maybe if I band with others, I could, you know, learn something different, contribute something different, and maybe we could do bigger things together, and maybe we could have more impact. So it's a journey. And the other element of collaboration is that to be willing to pool your funding with others. And as we said before, collaboration can take many different forms. Even sharing knowledge is a very good first step towards collaboration, right? But if we're talking about pooling funding, you have to be willing to give up some level of control, because the decisions about where the funding go will be made not by you alone with your foundation or with your family or with your team. It will be a joint decision. And, you know, not everybody is prepared to give up that control. And that has to, for many, many reasons, which we could, you know, also. Let me stop there.
Thanks, Silvia. I didn't want to bring up the E word of ego, but it is quite interesting how sometimes, you know, the sector gets accused of being kind of egocentric when our sector is focused on creating a public good. And inevitably, if you want to create a public good, by definition, you have to do it collaboratively. And I wonder where you talk about there how, you know, it's a learning curve. People like to start alone, and then there's a kind of epiphany that actually they can have more impact if they go together. And going back to our role at the CSP of sort of fast tracking some of those lessons learned, you know, I wonder if that is just an inevitable lesson or inevitable journey that people have to go on, or whether we can convince new philanthropists, second generation, that from the outset, they ponder a collaborative model. And I think we are seeing more and more the younger generation saying, I'm not going to set up a foundation like maybe my parents would have. I'm going to see if I can contribute to a fund. But anyway, thank you so much for that, Silvia. I'm going to hand back to Farida. Let's delve a little bit more into regional philanthropy, and perhaps also, Naila, I should mention again our efforts of the AFF to create a youth coalition. I think is very interesting. So the fact that many philanthropists in the region are actually working on a similar issue. In that particular case, it was of creation. So again, it's not like we are necessarily asking people to collaborate cross sectors. Obviously, it's easier if you're all working with the same goal. But back over to you, Farida.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Silvia, for that really valuable insight, I think, into this aspect of the topic. Naila, what I wanted to ask you is related to a first couple of questions that I'm getting, but also related to what we've seen in Tharawat as an organization, where there is always specifically family-owned businesses or family-owned family offices, where there is that family aspect, which means that you think in generations rather than in years in terms of the impact you want to have. So it's a very long-term commitment. Perhaps you are already, you know, the result of a legacy of maybe 80, 90 years of commercial but also social impact. So there's a very entrenched and very complex relationship that these entities and philanthropists often have with their local communities, but then also with the international community. So I was wondering if you had any experience with examples of successful collaborative models that we've seen in our region particularly, and perhaps you could also tell us a little bit in which sectors collaboration in our region might actually be successful, or, you know, perhaps more helpful.
Sure. So let me just, I'll try to kind of, you know, take it in little bits and pieces, because there's a lot that kind of builds on several of the questions that you're asking. I mean, like I was mentioning before, in terms of, you know, long-term collaborations that we've seen over time, we really only have anecdotal evidence of that. We don't have, you know, kind of institutional partnerships that have been built across many, many years. And again, I think, you know, if I can talk a little bit about the experience that, or the experiment that Claire was mentioning about our youth coalition, because it's very indicative of many of the reasons why sometimes these things don't necessarily play out the way you want them to. So the example of the youth coalition is our network. When Claire was the chair of our network at the time, she and I had kind of noticed that amongst our membership, a lot of the different members across, I mean, we're talking about, you know, 11 different countries, had all been working in one way or another around some sort of youth employment, youth empowerment, job creation projects, right? And in some cases in the same country, working in the same communities, but not together. So Claire at the time kind of, you know, had this call to action where we, you know, we spoke to the network and said, would you guys prefer if you kind of banded together and tried to create something that you could work on collaboratively rather than in these different individual silos? So, you know, it's all the buzzwords, like don't work in silos, work with each other, don't be, you know, don't obfuscate kind of your data, share your knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. And we had a lot of traction, in fact, a lot more traction than we thought we would, right? And a lot more buy-in than we thought we would. And people were very eager and said, absolutely, we'd love to. And so we had ideas of how to kind of create this coalition. We decided we wanted to create a youth coalition, which was a coalition built up of different actors across different sectors that would contribute to this one thing that would ultimately create, I mean, I can't remember the insane number that we came up with, but I think we said something like, 50,000 jobs over 3 years, or something idealistic and lovely. And again, the appetite was there, the engagement was high. And there are two different things that stopped us every single time we thought we'd made a little bit of progress. One is regional, so it's more of our kind of internal issues. And that had to do with, as the back end organization, as the support organization, AFF, our funding, because of restrictions, government restrictions, banking restrictions, was never sustained long enough for us to be able to keep that momentum going. Okay, so that's a hugely frustrating issue, right? Because you have the engagement, you have the buy-in, you have the resources, you have the capacity, and then all of a sudden your pipeline of funding gets cut off for reasons that are entirely external to your own control. But that's one issue. But the second issue was that we didn't have enough experience, and this goes to Silvia's point around collaboration being, kind of globally this thing that we're all lacking in expertise in how to create, is we couldn't find, even though we hired, and Claire will remember, a very expensive consulting firm to help us build a coalition. Nobody had the experience in how to successfully build a coalition across multi-stakeholders in different sectors, right? And it seemed like the easiest thing. Like, you'd think, we have the network, we have the members, we have the capacity, people are interested, people want to do it. They've already created the content, they've already created the programs, and some of these programs were already on their road to success. How to build a coalition that functions? First, I think we had it as a pyramid, and then we made it into a wheel, and then it was like cogs in a wheel. How do we get these cogs to work? So those are the two main issues that we faced. One is how to maintain that momentum, and two is how do you successfully build a coalition? So I think that, from the perspective of creating successful collaborative programming, or successful collaborative funding, or whatever it is, you have this issue on a global scale that we're finding that is a skill set that we're lacking. Mm-hmm. And then regionally, of course, those issues plague us in so many different parts of our work, but it was very evident in this particular part. So even though we know, I was just reading today, I think just today I saw, Al Ghurir Foundation is collaborating, and they're building partnerships, and they're actually claiming that 2020 for them was a huge year of partnerships. And that's interesting, because of the crisis of COVID was created this huge opportunity. People can't get on the ground and do this work that they were doing anymore by themselves. So whether they like it or not, they're going to have to collaborate. And I think this is, when we start talking about the new normal, which I'm so tired of that phrase, because frankly, we're in it. Like, it's not new. This is who we are now, right? This is who I am now. I work at home for the rest of my life. Or at least that's what it seems like. But that is an opportunity that, khalas, this is who we have to be, right? We have to understand that we've been given this opportunity, and somehow we better catch up with the potential of that opportunity to really understand how can we partner.
And I think that's a very good point. I see, Silvia, you've unmuted yourself, so I guess you have a comment on this.
Yes, Farid, I just wanted to build on something that Naila was saying, which is, it's exactly right. It is not simple to bring together a group of people to collaborate, especially with this a multi-stakeholder type of initiative. I would say that the three things that have been very helpful for us, the first one is you do need to have alignment on values. So with our initial group of core partners, we had a huge ongoing discussion about what are the values that we want to bring forward. So for example, for us, one of them is program partner centricity, which is that we're supportive of the people we give grants to, we're not directive. Another one is about, having a beginner's mind, meaning that we're open to learning, that we don't believe that we own the truth. We have a number of values that are also publicly shared, but having that group of people first agree on what are the values that we're putting forward is incredibly important. The second thing, which I would say, is having a neutral entity, like in your case, the Arab foundations, that can pull everybody together, because the collaboration that we have at CoImpact, we have the Gates Foundation, the Skoll Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. We have some of the big philanthropists and foundations in the world. And they themselves are not going to make the collaboration happen by themselves, right? So you do need this neutral entity, in this case it's CoImpact, that brings everybody together. And the third element I would say that is actually very important as well is making the rules of the game extremely clear. You know, how are decisions made? Where can you have influence? And for us, for example, it's separating very clearly the grant making from the funding, right? So essentially, in terms of selecting the opportunities that we're going to support, it's not about, you know, who our current funders are already supporting. Any initiative needs to go through our open sourcing process that we have on our website. We have it in multiple languages. We really want to discover organizations that are not the ones that have already gotten all the funding from everybody else or the donor darlings. We want to discover organizations and coalitions that are rooted in the countries in the Global South where they're working, that have the experience and the networks to really be able to pull off something very significant. We prioritize organizations that are led by women and that already have evidence of impact for the work that they're doing, and that they have a vision of how they could really do this at scale in a very significant way. So we have a number of criteria, and we're very, we stick very carefully to our criteria, right? And we think that that's also important, making the rules of the game, how we're going to collaborate. Otherwise, it becomes a little bit of trading favors, right? I support this organization. Great, we collaborate. Can you also give money there, or you know, different ways? So those are some of the ideas of how to do it.
I love that you have prescriptive solutions like that, Silvia. I mean, solutions, I say, you know, difficult to be finite about that. But I think this is what I really like about the work you do at CoImpact. And indeed, you shared with us a document prior to this webinar, which we can share with the group around the philosophy. But I like how specific you are about, you know, how do you make this? Okay, we all agree it's extremely difficult. We know the appetite is there. For us, the COVID, you know, opportunity and crisis, COVID really did fast track the recognition of the need for collaboration and it actually happening on the ground, quite simply because many organizations were like, we can't deal with the situation alone. We simply are going to have to work with others. Interestingly, our COVID-19 report revealed education was a great example where many philanthropists in emerging markets had been working with governments to promote digital education, getting all kids access online, and governments just weren't interested. And then COVID hit and governments were going to philanthropists and foundations saying, do you know how to make this happen? And multiple foundations that were single-handedly responsible for helping governments get education online. So I think it's interesting also you talk about values and basically the power balance, which again is something we looked at in our work, that COVID has started to shift the power balance so that it's no longer the global north dictating to the global south. And that's where networks help, because networks can empower and bring about like-minded organizations under an umbrella, under an ecosystem, lobby for different best practice, to lobby for things like core funding, which we know is so fundamental to resilience, and yet so many funders are still, I'm not so sure about funding salaries, let me just fund the program. So I think COVID has, in a way, I hope, helped us to create the case for collaboration much more strongly than prior to the crisis. But I'm wondering specifically, are there elements or aspects of policy or practice that still have not been addressed that can help us bring really co-funding opportunities together? So maybe that's a question for both Naila and Silvia. Maybe first to you, Naila. So what more can we do?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, Silvia, you literally, like, I had 3 points, and the first one was shared values, alignment on values for any successful collaboration. So thanks a lot for stealing that from me. But anyway, it just shows that, yeah, I mean, that is obviously number one.
That's a great collaborative spirit, Naila.
There you go, right? Yeah. So maybe I should have said thank you for sharing that with me rather than stealing. I apologize. But then, you know, the other thing is also, like, I think when we're talking about the region, so let me just stick specifically to the region, and to talk about, you know, some of the the value of collaboration within the philanthropic sector is that once you've been able to identify those three things, right? So once you've been able to identify the network, that the neutral entity that can help you, the shared values, and what are your shared expected outcomes, right? And what are the rules of, and in terms of roles and responsibilities, we know that we have very high potential to collaborate because we have very similar needs across the region, right? Of course, every different country has its own unique and individual needs, but overall, we tend to have similar needs around youth. We are a population of 49% of the population of the Arab region is under the age of 25. That is the largest youth population in the world. So it's extremely significant, but also extremely disenfranchised, right? So that's number one. We know that this is a very easy kind of, low-hanging fruit. The health sector, we know that the health sector, and nothing has kind of, highlighted that more than 2020 and COVID-19. We know that there's a lot of need in the health sector, and that the health sector cannot improve individually with little, projects one by one. It has to be a collaborative effort. We know that education is obviously another one, that region-wide, the disparities across the region are very big. And so there needs to be, there could be a lot of collaboration in terms of learning how to maybe better that sector. And then civic engagement, because again, this is a region where in the last, forever really, but more specifically 2011 was kind of a revival of the seemingly perennial issue of civic disruption. That civic engagement is a big one. And again, it ties back into this very big youth population, because ultimately this is the future, right? I mean, we have 49% of our population is going to be ultimately running our societies. And so if we don't have that civic engagement from the beginning, then, we're doomed. And then we just, keep getting into these loops of the same issues repeating over and over and over again. So we have a need to kind of do this forensic analysis of what are the outcomes and the consequences of not paying attention to these things. And so then that kind of gives us the opportunity to come together and figure out ways where, philanthropy can address each of these issues in more longer term. But then another thing around this legacy that you were talking about, Farida, which I think is very important. Of course, there's huge value in the idea that we have legacy philanthropy that is thinking decades, generations ahead, which is great. We also come from a region where very long-term planning is like the best way to have everything go up in flames, right? Because you plan for everything and then tomorrow your entire government is changed. If you were living in Egypt, you've gone through that in between 2011 and 2013 3 times, right? So you've toppled one regime, you had another, you toppled the other regime, you've had a third in the span of 3 years. So making plans is great, and having kind of like your legacy plan is great, but then also being adaptable,
sure.
And flexible to change, and knowing how to navigate that, right? And knowing how to kind of how to flexibly be able to navigate whatever your intended outcomes are. So I can see, like, there's one person that wrote in the chat, an anonymous person, but talking about how family businesses have known how to maybe navigate around restrictions. And while that's true, more and more the families that are establishing foundations and thinking long term are starting to face the same regulations that the rest of the sector is facing, irrespective of their connection to private sector, right?
Well, it's interesting. Thank you so much, Naila. I'm very aware of time, so we have about 10 more minutes. So what I want to do is perhaps a small quick fire round with some of the questions that I'm getting from the audience, so that we can kind of round off the conversation a little bit. Just to comment on what you've just said, Naila, I do believe that, working with family businesses on a daily basis, in a way, the behavior that we need to display with regards to our operating businesses, which is a combination of a long-term vision, but an agility in the short term and the decision-making capacity in the short term, is actually very similar to what we apparently need to do in the philanthropic space. So I think it's actually quite a helpful comparison, because I do feel that sometimes people go too far away from their kind of organic type of behavior, which they are used to when they're dealing with their companies. If you translate that into the philanthropic field, you might actually get a much more efficient system, if we did not think that it was such a different space to behave in. a small question to Tharawat from one of our attendees is if we can connect families with similar interests or find case studies. Of course, this is why we are here. This is why we collaborate with CSP. And of course, also we should learn from this session as an organization that obviously the 4 organizations that we have represented here today, just amongst us, there are already so many synergies, which we absolutely should take advantage of, seeing the positive effect that I see now in the messages that I'm getting everywhere. That people are looking for that connectivity. So I think it's our duty as platforms to really create a network of networks and make sure that people who are seeking that connection really can get access to it. So perhaps to slowly close off the session, I'll try to summarize a few questions that we have still open and audience questions into a concluding one. If you were to face or if you had a meeting with, let's say, a philanthropic organization or an individual philanthropist, let's assume they're not one of the huge organizations or institutional philanthropists, but really a private, either individual or family business that would like to continue their philanthropic work, but add a collaborative dimension to it, perhaps in a specific project or for a specific topic. Maybe starting off with Silvia, can you give us, you're very good with points, so I'm going to start with you. Can you give us 3-4 points that you would say, these people can start doing or how they can approach the situation to kick off a collaborative model?
That's a really good question. So I would say, first thing is realize that you can have much more impact by collaborating with others. And we've mentioned already that it's more efficient, that it delivers the forms of capital that the nonprofits need, all of that. The things we have not mentioned, which I also think are very important, is it can help your own learning. It can also help to leverage the funding because you pool with others. You can have much bigger pots of funding. It can decrease your risk, right? Because you may want to support an organization, but you're not 100% sure. If you only put one little bit and somebody else does the rest, then it helps you. And I also think it helps address this power dynamics that we were talking about. Yes. Because then it's not you as a single philanthropist controlling and deciding. It's you with a group, and I think that can be beneficial. Mm-hmm. And in addition to all the advantages that collaboration brings, the other thing I would say is ultimately, you don't have to think of your philanthropy in only one way. So you can have, part of your funding towards a collaborative that is trying to achieve something very significant. You can also have part of your funding that you decide together with your family for a local initiative in your country, in your region, in your locality, right? So it doesn't mean that all of your funding needs to go in the same way. You can also have a portfolio approach. But what I would say to any philanthropist or any foundation is, please make sure that at least with a portion of your funding, you are supporting this type of collaborative pooled fund.
I think that's a very nice kind of way of looking at it, and might also motivate people to look at it from that perspective of saying, I kind of look at it from a portfolio perspective as well. Before coming to you, Claire, for some closing words, Naila, I don't want to close with kind of a negative perspective, but I think because you are in the region and you've mentioned some of these obstacles, that we are facing, if I were to ask you a similar question, but with the perspective of, if I want to collaborate on regional projects, based on your experience, what are some of the things I can do to increase the likelihood for it to succeed?
Yeah, that's actually a perfect question, building on what Silvia was saying. And I've also made points, Farida, so that I can be
I knew you were
that I can be useful. No, I mean, I think in addition to everything Silvia was saying, you need to talk to the experts on the ground. You need to talk and listen to what people are telling you is needed, right? And sometimes you may find it's not necessarily exactly aligned with what your family legacy wanted to be funding. Maybe 80 years ago, that was the right thing to fund, and today that's not the right thing to fund. And when you talk to those experts and you talk to the implementers and the facilitators on the ground, you'll know more where the gaps are, right? The other thing is engage in networks. Engage with networks that are your peers, of your peers. and share your information. Because if you're sharing your information, then you're also enabling and encouraging other people to share their information. It's the only way that we're going to get over those issues that keep hindering our progress. And then think strategically about how to best employ your funding. So salaries aren't sexy. I know that they're not sexy. I've been fundraising for years, but they are very, very important.
Vital.
And paying salaries for development support organizations like an AFF or other organizations like mine are even more difficult to secure, because that's essentially all you're paying for. You're paying for the people sitting in their offices or their homes or whatever, doing the work that then enables you to not have to do that part of the organization, that part of the coordination. And so that's also important. And its sustainability is important, because I can tell you from personal experience, as a support network, as a network for these types of organizations that relies almost exclusively on funding and external funding, because we're not program based. I don't have anything fancy and beautiful that I can say, look at us, how amazing we are, give us $9 million. But what I can say is, when we have consistent funding to support you, there's so much we can take off of your plate, right, that can help move this forward. So those are really the three key things: is listen to the experts, share your data, and think more strategically about where your money is going and how much long-term it can make an impact.
I think that's really insightful, Naila, and great points. But I think it's really essential that we do approach funding from a much more transparent. We do think we have transparency, but I sometimes think it is more kind of lip service with regards to kind of what you want to hear rather than what you need to hear, where the funds are being deployed. So Claire, I'll hand over to you for a couple of closing words before we refer to our next session as well.
Just very quickly, since we're very short on time, but I'm delighted. There was a really great discussion, and I'm delighted that you're all aligned with the findings of our report. So reassured that our research is aligned with what's happening in the market. And indeed, as both Silvia and Naila have just said, some of the three recommendations that we came out with was exactly using networks, funding networks, supporting networks, offering core funding to build resilience, and finally working in collaboration, particularly with governments. So we align with national agendas and help governments understand the value of philanthropic capital. We at the CSP will continue to work in this space with our partners, Tharawat. I encourage you all to please read our report. We sent it in advance, but it's also on our website. We are, of course, particularly interested in our friends in the Arab world. Our founder, Badr Jaffer, is from the Arab world, and I spend a lot of my career there. So I hope this is just the beginning of working more closely with the AFF and CoImpact to really take this conversation forward in a practical way.
Thank you so much, Claire. And so to close off, I'd also like to thank all our attendees of today. We hope that this was helpful. We are always aiming to be very, straightforward and practical in tackling very complex questions, actually. So we do hope you enjoyed it. I want to point out that, of course, the CSP and Tharawat are continuing on this journey. Our next webinar in our our last actually webinar in our three-part series on aligning philanthropy is going to take place on the 17th of February. And it's going to speak about integrating impact into business strategy. So as you see, we keep trying to highlight or to discuss kind of the different spaces or the different aspects of philanthropic activities in family-owned entities. I'd like to thank Naila, I'd like to thank Silvia for their wonderful contributions, for really having given us such a very concise but really deep insight into this rather complex topic. And I'd like to thank all our participants who've been really, really helpful in adjusting our questions as well to make sure that they are as relevant as possible to your realities. We wish you all a very happy rest of the week, and stay safe and see you very soon. Thank you so much.